This is the third part of Chapter 7 on the nervous system and control of skeletal muscles in our exercise physiology text. This will take us to the end of the chapter. In the last section, we were talking about control of muscle tension during muscle contraction. We defined motor unit recruitment as the major mechanism for controlling tension. We said that the more tension you want to produce, the more motor neurons you activate in your motor cortex, which we'll talk about more today, and each motor neuron is wired or innervates a group of muscle cells. So each motor unit or neuron plus its group of muscle cells add to the tension and produce a stronger contraction. We also discovered that we start out recruiting small motor units with just a few muscle cells per motor neuron, and as recruitment proceeds, we activate larger and larger motor units, more and more muscle cells per motor neuron. There's an interesting biography, a little bio of a famous scientist of exercise physiology that's described in our textbook, and he is the guy who introduced the notion of the size principle. He also noticed that smaller motor neurons in the motor cortex are more easily activated. Smaller motor neurons actually represent smaller motor units, and larger motor neurons have branches to more muscle cells. So not only do we start out with smaller motor units and then increase as we recruit, it's more easy to activate smaller motor neurons, which may actually be the reason that we initiate smaller motor units first, and then as we increase the intensity of our desire to contract the muscles, we get bigger motor units. So you can read up a little bit on that. There's another really interesting feature of recruitment, change that occurs during the process of recruitment that impacts tension production and metabolism. The first motor units recruited are not only small in muscle cell number, they're smaller fibers. Not all muscle cells are alike, and type 1 fibers are aerobic, slow-contracting, smaller muscle cells that are good at just continuing their contractions all day long because of that heavy mitochondria content and lots of aerobic respiration. And as we recruit, we go to larger and larger muscle fibers until we reach the maximum. The other extreme is type 2X fibers that are anaerobic. They have few mitochondria. They're big, fast, and strong. They produce a lot of specific tension, and they contract more quickly. So that is a wonderful thing to discover, because it shows that as we recruit more and more motor units, as we are exercising more intensely, we already knew that we move into anaerobic respiration. Glucose or carbohydrates is the sole fuel source, and here's one reason for that. We're starting to recruit cells. That's what they do. They do anaerobic respiration, but they're big and strong. They allow us to do those maximum power production episodes. Another topic of this section of the chapter is the vestibular apparatus. That's talking about the two sensor types in your inner ear that allow us to kind of keep track of our center of gravity, our movements of the body as a whole, to maintain our balance, and also activate reflexes that control eye movement, so we look in the direction of movement of the body and we don't collide with things. Keep our head up in a position where we're able to take in information about our activities. There's two types of sensors. One type of sensor detects head position and linear acceleration. In other words, if you're at a dead stop and you start moving forward, that's an acceleration, a change in speed. And these detectors sense that. They're called the macula. And they also detect slowing down. So if you're going in a straight line, speeding up or slowing down, they can record that. There's another set of receptors that recognizes or senses rotational acceleration. If you start to rotate your body or slow down the rotation, these receptors will report. So anytime the head moves, we get a report of some kind from these two receptor types. We have a good idea of what's happening there. There's a system in the brainstem for integrating a lot of different inputs to help us keep control of our posture and our balance and so forth. It includes visual inputs, proprioceptor inputs, inputs from those vestibular sensors we just talked about, proprioceptor information from the cerebellum, and produces the outputs that help us with our balance and so forth. The proprioceptors, the joint, tendon, and muscle receptors, actually report directly to the cerebellum, which talks back and forth to the vestibular nuclei, just clusters of neurons in the brainstem. So you can see these are very closely related systems that help us keep track of our balance and keep our center of gravity under control, keep our weight over our base, as they say. Let's take a look at some parts of the brain. We'll zoom in on just a tiny bit on the brain and see what we may make of it. Maybe introduce some parts of the brain that are important in controlling movement, particularly. So the cerebrum of the brain is the outer part of this big mass of the brain. Well, it's actually this entire big mass of the brain, and it's where all those ridges and valleys are seen, all those familiar looking wrinkles that you see in the brain. The cerebellum is like a whole separate little brain down here, attached onto the rest of your nervous system by way of the brainstem. This is the brainstem right here. So the cerebellum has lots of neurons coming and going, and they wire into the brainstem, which is in turn connected to the rest of the cerebrum. It sort of looks like it's completely cut off, but there's a relay station right here. It's actually deep to the picture that we're looking at, and also on the closer to us than the picture. This happens to be in a little space in the middle. There's a relay station that connects the brainstem to the cerebrum and so forth, and then from the brainstem to the cerebellum. So there's connections from the highest level of the hierarchy of control up here through the thalamus to the brainstem and the cerebellum and back. So the cortex is the outer layer of the cerebrum. It's where the neuron cell bodies are. So if we cut through the cerebrum, we'd see that the surface is actually a different color. You can see the gray matter there. That's where all the neurons are that allow a lot of processing to take place. It's the origin and initiation of complex movement, as we'll see in a bit. It's also where we store memories of various types, memories of experiences we have that we're conscious of, and a different kind of memory of motor skills, patterns of muscle contraction that produce certain results that we call a skill. We get better and better at some motor activity, and we store that information so we don't have to reinvent it every time we go out onto the soccer field, for example, and try to do a corner kick. I don't know why I think of that every time, corner kicks. All the sensory information from our body, the somatic sensory information, that is, the conscious sensory information, comes to the cortex also and allows us to process that and perceive what's happening to our body from around us. Part of the cerebral cortex is called the motor cortex. Motor, as you know, refers to information going out from the central nervous system to the periphery to control muscles and glands, and so the motor cortex has motor neurons that control the skeletal muscles. Before we get more into talking about how the motor cortex interacts with the rest of the cerebrum and with the cerebellum and so forth, let's just quickly mention something interesting. Muscle fatigue is defined as kind of a reduction in the tension produced by muscles, the contraction of muscles, in spite of our desire to continue contracting them, or in some ways our desire. That might be a little abstract. And we've referred already to some things that contribute to muscle fatigue. Peripheral factors such as depletion of glycogen, production of lactic acid, and acidification of the cytoplasm or sarcoplasm of muscle cells interferes with cross-bridge cycling and calcium management and so forth. So we have weakening of the muscles. But there's also something called central fatigue, which involves changes in your brain. More recent investigations and theories involve the notion that your brain doesn't produce as many stimuli of the skeletal muscles as you get deeper and deeper into an exercise bout. So it may even be that the neurotransmitters and some of the neurons in the pathways that sort of develop the muscle plans and then send impulses to the muscles just don't have enough neurotransmitter after a while to keep sending as many impulses or stimuli to the muscles themselves. So something in the brain is starting to slow down and reduce activation of the muscles. Sort of like a subset of that is what's called the central governor theory. The idea that built into the complex systems in your cerebrum that control muscle contraction is like a safety net or a limiting feature so that we don't overdo things metabolically. You can't exercise yourself to death. You can't just push yourself to the point where you will use up so much energy that you wouldn't even be able to support your nervous system and you would just maybe keel right over, or wouldn't be able to support your heart any longer and it wouldn't get enough nutrients and it would fail. So this is the idea that as metabolism becomes intensified and more waste products are produced and so forth, and acidification happens, some neurons in the brain begin to put the brakes on your output from your motor cortex to your muscles so that you don't overdo the whole thing and get yourself into a catastrophic disruption of homeostasis. That's a wonderful turn of phrase. Another quick aside, the notion of traumatic brain injury. The cerebrum and all the brain parts of the brain are extraordinarily complex and relatively delicate, and if you strike your cranium on something, the cerebrum or the brain will then impact the wall of the cranium, the bones that surround the brain, and there'll be damage. Concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury that involves some changes in behavior and function of the brain that are tabulated in another slide. Concussions have taken a real direct focus of our attention with respect to sports and athletics, because we found out that concussions, while relatively quickly resolved in terms of the observable effects on behavior and on perception, repeated brain injuries cause lifelong damage to the brain. But even more immediately, more acutely, severe impacts of the brain with the cranium can lead to swelling, life-threatening swelling life-threatening swelling in the cranium. The brain, once it impacts with the cranium, then will bounce and strike the cranium on the opposite side. That's called second impact syndrome, and sometimes that produces a greater injury to the brain than the initial concussion, the initial impact. So we have a great deal of interest in learning how to, first of all, prevent concussions during sports, but also how to identify them so that we can wait for complete recovery and then protect people who have had concussions from repeat injuries. So here are some characteristics of changes that take place when people have had a concussion. How can we know when someone's had a concussion? Watch for these changes: vision changes, nausea and vomiting, headaches that are unexplained or related to the event, changes in brain function, memory, lack of memory, difficulty concentrating, all these different things that changes that take place in a person. So we need to keep track and follow up with someone who's had a head impact and continually ask the kind of questions that will help us reveal these changes and identify whether they have a concussion and when they're starting to resolve from that concussion. Again, repeated concussions or traumatic brain injuries will potentially lead to a permanent destruction of neural tissue in the brain. So that's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which means something wrong with the brain, damage to the brain. It's the manifestations are much like Alzheimer's disease, a disease in which there's degradation of the nervous tissue that leads to loss of memories and loss of eventually motor function and finally death. And so CTE is in appearance like Alzheimer's disease, but different etiology, different cause. Alzheimer's disease is associated with precipitation of protein plaques in the brain that are then connected in some way with death of neurons in the brain. CTE also is degradative, but it's not. There's no plaques that form of beta amyloid the way there is with Alzheimer's. So it's not like we're turning on Alzheimer's. It's a different kind of a thing, but it's a similar, very horrible outcome. Okay, back to our discussion of what parts of the brain do what when it comes to motor control. The cerebellum is that little extra sort of side brain that we saw, that inferior and posterior structure relative to the brain, and it receives all the proprioceptor information. We've talked about them many times. That's where they terminate. The cerebellum is like a clearinghouse for maintaining observation or analysis of all that information coming from the proprioceptors. And the motor cortex is going to rely on the cerebellum with all that detailed proprioceptor information to fine-tune motor control plans. When you execute an activity with your body, it takes many muscle contractions and a very precise timing and order to make those things happen and maintain our balance and do everything it takes to get the job done. And so the motor cortex elicits information from the brainstem, from the cerebellum by way of the thalamus to get that information. The motor cortex then has axons that extend down the spinal cord to the skeletal muscles, or to some lower motor neurons, which then control the skeletal muscles. So I'll show you a schematic diagram that'll make it a little clearer. All these words may not be getting through in terms of it's probably getting kind of jumbled in your mind, and I don't blame you. It would be in mine too. I'm just saying that it'll be good if we can get a picture of what's going on here in just a little bit. So the motor cortex starts developing a rough draft of a plan, solicits information from the cerebellum that has that proprioceptor information. The cerebellum returns a modified, enhanced plan to the motor cortex to actually execute onto the muscles. The brainstem is kind of between the cerebellum and the cerebrum and the rest of the spinal cord and the body, the peripheral nervous system. It includes the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. This is actually kind of inverted. So if the cerebrum is down here standing on your head, the midbrain is the highest level of the brainstem, then the pons, and the medulla oblongata is the lowest part, or the most inferior part of your brainstem, and then gives rise to the spinal cord. Well, anyway, the pons and medulla and midbrain have, and the reticular formation contain clusters of neurons, nuclei, that control very important vital functions of your body, such as regulation of heart rate, blood pressure, ventilation, meaning breathing, metabolic activity, complex reflexes that allow us to do things like keeping track of our balance and our head position and so forth, and our eye direction. So the brainstem is like the actual machine control room where all the levers and knobs are to control all the equipment, the heart, and the blood vessels, smooth muscle, and all these different structures in your body. The hypothalamus is the overseer, the sort of engineering management center that uses these controls in your brainstem to manage all those variables. So it's sort of a hierarchical system. But if anything happens to the brainstem, you're going to be in deep water because of the vital nature of these functions. The spinal cord contains some wired in or built in pattern generators that are called for motor function. In other words, the motor cortex, we said, sends instructions down the spinal cord by way of its neuron axons, but it doesn't have to discretely control every single muscle in succession to operate the musculoskeletal system. Some of the patterns of muscle contraction, series of muscle contractions, are already wired into the spinal cord neurons so that a more general command can be sent from above, from the motor cortex, which will then produce a whole bunch of responses in the body as desired. So it just frees up the motor cortex from having to plan out every single impulse that comes to a skeletal muscle, and some of it is automated in the spinal cord. That's called spinal tuning. Actually, reflexes are also, some somatic reflexes are housed in the spinal cord. Well, some autonomic reflexes, but we're focusing on somatic reflexes. One of the reflexes is called the withdrawal reflexes. What we mean by that is, even though we're talking about the skeletal muscles, which are voluntarily controlled, sometimes a stimulus will elicit a involuntary response in the muscular system. So one such example is the withdrawal reflex. And let's skip over this and go to a diagram. It'll explain everything that's in those words of the slide. when the muscle spindles are activated, when a muscle lengthens and the muscle spindle proprioceptors are activated by muscle stretch, it activates a sensory neuron that synapses in the spinal cord. This is a little transverse section through the spinal cord that activates a alpha motor neuron, it's called. That's just one of the motor neurons we've been talking about all along, which causes flexor muscles to contract in the limb. So a noxious stimulus, here we see a little injury happening on the foot, activates a sensory neuron which causes flexor muscles to contract to withdraw the limb from that stimulus. We don't continue to endure the painful response. That same sensory neuron, though, synapses with another interneuron in the spinal cord, this little one in between, which activates an extensor neuron in the opposite limb. That's called the cross-extensor reflex. So not only do we withdraw the limb from the noxious stimulus, we extend the contralateral or opposite limb so we can shift our way to the other leg and have some support for the body while we withdraw the injured limb. So that's the withdrawal reflex and cross-extensor reflex. Pretty cool stuff. So we don't have to have any knowledge of this happening. It happens automatically even though we're talking about skeletal muscles. Now let's take a brief look at motor control. Now that slide just says in words again what I'm about to show you in this diagram. I attempted to make a little schematic diagram of kind of the series of events, very simplified series of events that occur when we want to move the musculoskeletal system. So first thing that happens is this is the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, where a lot of complex processing happens, executive function it's called, our personality, various judgments, creative thinking. We get the idea that we want to do something, and we produce a goal for some motor task we want to accomplish, and since we're talking about motor function, and then that information is forwarded onto the premotor cortex. This is a part of the cerebral cortex that will draft a plan of a series and timing of muscle contractions that would presumably allow us to reach the goal that we've set, but it's only a rough draft of a plan. The premotor cortex will then interact in a kind of a looping fashion with the basal nuclei. See this sort of arcing looking structure, some deeper parts of the cerebrum, as well as the cerebellum, using the thalamus as a relay station to obtain a modified plan. Remember, the cerebellum has all the proprioceptor information, and it can enhance, modify, and increase the accuracy of the motor contraction plan, which will then be returned to the premotor cortex. So we send information to the basal nuclei and to the cerebellum, get an update, and then by way of the thalamus get back an enhanced motor plan, and then execute that. The primary motor cortex is all the actual neurons, motor neurons, that can control the skeletal muscles. So this is like a piano player activating the right skeletal muscles in the right sequence on this keyboard console to control the muscles. And again, not every single muscle, because there's spinal tuning. Some of the commands can be more general, and automated patterns of muscle contraction can be initiated down in the spinal cord to move the body in the way we want. So axons from the primary motor cortex, I didn't want to make this drawing get too crazy, but all this green area has all axons that travel straight down through the spinal cord to the level of the skeletal muscles in question, and then motor neurons then activate those skeletal muscles. So here's just a box diagram of that same thing happening. So we start out with an idea for a motor plan. Premotor cortex forms a rough draft, solicits information from the requisite parts of the brain that have the data. Information sent back to the premotor cortex by way of the thalamus, and then executing the plan on the primary motor cortex, and then that activates the motor units. And then the sensory divisions receive feedback, and while this plan is being executed, a whole nother motor plan of an updated motor plan relative to what's already accomplished is starting to form, and so we keep on executing updated motor plans and adjusting them as needed until we complete the task. The autonomic nervous system is the involuntary motor divisions, right? Outgoing information that we're not aware of, and it has two different parts to it, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system we've been talking about a lot already. It involves motor neurons, pairs of motor neurons that activate the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, and motor neurons that innervate various organs in the thoracic and abdominal cavities and so forth, and in the head and neck, that allow us to do the things we do during exercise, allow all those changes to take place that we've been referring to, mobilizing fuels for exercise, increasing heart rate and blood pressure, increasing depth and rate of breathing. All those things are functions of the sympathetic nervous system by way of the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine and neurotransmitters, as well as other hormones that they activate, such as glucagon. So here's just a kind of a listing out of some of the things, as I said, that the sympathetic nervous system does for us during exercise. Increased heart rate. We talked about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system that causes vasoconstriction to support blood pressure, as well as increasing blood volume. Aldosterone causes the kidneys to retain salt and water. We're going to divert blood flow from the gastrointestinal and digestive system, the kidneys, to the working muscles by vasoconstricting those organs. We're going to mobilize glucose from glycogen stores and from fatty acids from adipose tissue, so we have fuels for exercise. Dilate the airways, relax those smooth muscles so we can breathe better, to really start breathing during exercise. Helping us dissipate the heat produced during muscle contraction by activating sweat glands and vasodilating, bringing more blood to the surface and the skin. So those are some of the things that we know about that the sympathetic nervous system does. The parasympathetic nervous system is called the rest and digest system oftentimes, and it's a maintenance system. So after you eat a meal, it activates digestion and absorption of the nutrients, insulin release and storage of those nutrients as glycogen, fat, adipose tissue, triglycerides, proteins, synthesizing more protein. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system. So its neurons, where they synapse on their target organs, release acetylcholine instead of norepinephrine. Exercise inhibits the parasympathetic division and activates the sympathetic division. So we don't want to be doing storage. We want to be releasing or mobilizing fuels for exercise. And here's kind of a little diagram showing the layout of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. And here are some of the target organs that are affected, as we've kind of been alluding to already. Sympathetic division arises in the spinal cord, and pairs of motor neurons activate the target organs by way of norepinephrine release as the neurotransmitter. Parasympathetic nervous system originates in the brainstem and the sacral region of the spinal cord, and the pairs of motor neurons activate or inhibit the target organs by releasing acetylcholine. Exercise is so important for so many aspects of health. Here's yet another thing, since we're talking about the nervous system. Exercise promotes nervous system health, and it also diminishes the rate of advancement of degradative or degenerative diseases of the brain, such as multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease, and maybe ameliorates or reduces the severity of injuries that are produced by situations like a stroke. So exercise is so important throughout life. Just more things to tell yourself as those voices tell you to stop exercising, or tell your clients as you're trying to engage them in exercise programs for their own benefit about the nervous system. All right, that concludes our Chapter 7, and join me as we move on to talk in more detail about skeletal muscles in Chapter